Video recordings of this podcast can be found on raisingequity.org and Raising Equity on YouTube.
Welcome to Raising Equity. Today we have a special topic in honor of Veterans Day. We're going to think about the intersection of being a veteran, mental health, and race-based traumatic stress. We have with us an expert in that area, Dr. Marva Robinson. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and especially for such an important topic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe give us a framework around that intersection. Like, why do we need to be focused on the mental health of our veterans, other than the obvious of we should honor them and make sure we care for them because they made such a sacrifice?
Absolutely. You know, whenever I think of veteran, for me, mental health is synonymous. Because anytime you have someone who is thrusted into an environment that's not natural for them, you know, like boot camp, and they're shipped overseas, and, you know, whether if they're in combat or not, that is a huge adjustment, right? And so there are some things that happen in response to that. And so even if, you know, vets were in combat or not, we need to think about their adjustment, their family that they left behind, you know, life at home still continues for them. If they've lost loved ones and they can't be there. So, I mean, there's just a lot that goes into that. And plus, these are men and women who voluntarily signed their name on the dotted line to defend our freedom and liberties.
Well, and you bring up such a good point that I sometimes don't think about, right? Like, we think about veterans and automatically think of them in combat. Right. And I mean, I know when I stop and think about it, but all the other pressures that they're navigating.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I do a social identity exercise in some of the workshops that I do. And it asks people to think about like their race, their gender, sexual orientation, all different social identities. And in the past, I'd say 7 or 8 years, have made sure that there's an other category because so many people who are veterans felt like that's a part of their identity and they want it represented. It
absolutely is.
Yeah.
I think any veteran will tell you, especially the ones that I've worked with through private practice or through my organization, is that you don't come out the same way you went in, right? And that's whether if you held the gun or shot someone or not, that it is a life-changing process. And so we have a lot of veterans, a great majority, that never ever go to combat, yet life is just not the same when they return. So a lot of things happen. There's different pressures, expectations. And unfortunately for veterans of color, you know, that experience also comes with a very different experience.
And I think some people might be surprised by that because a few things that I've heard with folks in the military. One, people assume it's the military. So it's all about merit and rank. It's not about race.
Right.
And two, people say, well, we don't have segregated ranks anymore, regiments anymore. So why would race be a problem? Can you talk about how that intersection plays out?
Because actually, several of the vets that I've talked to have said, you know, I joined the military to escape the discrimination and racism that was going on. You know, I wanted to find a way to get out of, you know, colored only and all of this in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so I just thought that when I went, that things would just be better. And they found out that it actually was worse. You know, and so because rank and status mean so much, they quickly discovered that a lot of what they went through was discrimination, being passed over, not being assigned appropriate MOSs or occupations.
What's MOS?
MOS, so it's like their occupation,
the
job title that they have, who's being assigned to certain duties and certain details. All of that they quickly discovered was definitely had a very racial undertone to it.
And I imagine some of these veterans, like you said, they're wanting to escape the racism, are older. So when they went into the military, things were different in our society.
Correct. And they found out that going in, it was still no different. But even our younger vets experienced the same thing. And so, you know, when I've worked with, you know, older versus younger, it's so surprising to see that not much has changed. And even when vets get together themselves, you know, because a lot of them have social outings where they get together and they, there's the older vets are sad to see that not much has changed from my generation to now. And so unfortunately, it's still, a very big issue that has to be addressed.
I was thinking about a cousin of mine who was in training, and I believe he was studying Russian, and he really enjoyed it.
Okay.
But he was getting a lot of pushback, almost kind of getting haze. Like, can you do this? And was getting pushed out of Russian to, I don't remember which language. And I remember just listening to him and wondering how much of it had to do with race. Like, how much of it had to do with, we don't know that you'll fit. Should you learn Russian? This black guy who knows Russian.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like, what will we do with you? Or do we trust you?
Right. Yeah.
All of the dynamics. And, all I could do was listen because I'm not in his shoes and
absolutely
can't decide his trajectory.
Same thing for me. I have several family members who I'm very close to and talk to that have served our country. And I listen. And even though through my private practice, I've worked with vets, it doesn't make me able to say, I know what that's like. I totally respect the fact that I know nothing about what it's like to go through boot camp or hiking and camping and all of that. So it is very much about respecting that space. But the stories that I hear from my family, mirror that as well. Joining the Navy, wanting to do one thing, but being pushed, to this other occupation that had nothing to do with what they tested in for.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask what sort of stories can you tell? But I know, being in private practice, we can't use names. There's confidentiality.
Exactly.
But if there are stories that you can share with folks to help them see how race intersects with the experience of being a veteran or being in the military.
I mean, there are even documentaries that are out there. There are blogs, there are stories, there are books that can definitely refer to the experience of being Black in Vietnam. I, in doing my own research, realized where the DAP came from. I would see people, dap each other up with the hand signals. And I just thought, oh, okay, you see it in sports or whatever. Did not realize that started in Vietnam.
Really?
Because the racism was so intense that you would have Black soldiers being killed by friendly fire. And so they developed a way of being able to signify that I'm safe and you're safe. So that's where the DAP came from.
Really?
Yeah, I know, right? And so there were, reading stories like that were just fascinating that, they didn't want them to be in the military, but they were drafted in and then they were put on the front lines to be the ones who were first. Or if race riots would break out in different camps, that all of a sudden they would, die by friendly fire. And it's because they were being killed by other white soldiers. Like, these things literally happened, and there are real stories that account for this. It's, so you'll hear a lot of them say, I didn't know who to trust, and they wanted me to go out and kill these people who were the enemy, but it was really the enemy that was in my bunker, and so it's those kind of things you think about. You're away from home, you're in a totally different country, a different space, and who's supposed to have your back really doesn't. How can you return home and be the same? How can you trust a system and not really be sure of if that system is working for you or against you?
Right. And that's so hard for people to hear. And I think they don't sometimes stop and think about the horrors that individuals went through and then to feel like, oh, to not stop that from happening, that means the system is complicit.
Correct. Yeah.
Do you remember the name of the artist so people can learn more about it?
Yes, I actually found his work online. His name is Lamont Hamilton. He had an exhibition with the Smithsonian. And so it talks all about his journey in learning more about the DAP, because you'll look at clips of different basketball players and football players with these intricate, handshakes and things like that. And so he talked about his journey in learning where it came from. And so he interviewed and spoke with veterans, Black veterans from Vietnam.
Any other resources that you would point people towards, movies or?
I mean, just to gain a better understanding, if we're talking about movies, Red Tails, is a good movie to watch. The Tuskegee Airmen would be another one. Just to kind of get a framework and an understanding of, the extra lens of being a veteran of color while serving in the military.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know that there's different organizations that have focused on justice and veteran status. Brian Stevenson.
Absolutely.
I think he did something related to that.
Yeah. About a year ago, he also produced a piece talking about the experience of Black veterans. And so you can even find, that article online. That's a really good read as well.
Yeah. He's done great work. I want to make my way down to the lynching museum.
Absolutely. I've heard a lot about it.
Have you?
I've had a couple people that have gone, that it's definitely an experience that stays with you for a while. So
I would imagine.
yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I have uncles and other family members who I know served, but they don't want to talk about it.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I respect that. I have one uncle in particular who I love dearly. And I remember taking a class on Vietnam in undergrad. And I don't know if I called him or happened to, maybe it was around Thanksgiving, right? Clearly November.
Right.
And I thanked him for his service. This was when I was in college. So that was late 90s.
Mhm.
He said I was the first person to ever thank him for his service.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of different dynamics with especially his service, because I have an uncle who also served in Vietnam. And one is, being told to do a job for your country, right? To preserve liberties and freedoms, and then coming back and being spit on and called horrific names. So not wanting to identify that, yeah, I was there, but then also not having the same level of recognition because you served and you were a veteran of color. So there's a lot of different lenses when it comes to this discussion about equity and veterans and combat and all of that. But yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. My uncle served in Vietnam, and we knew just not to talk about it a lot. He struggled with nightmares. I can remember that when I was younger. These horrific nightmares and waking up and so it wasn't until, later in life, shortly before he passed, that he showed me his Purple Heart pendant and showed us his flag. And, he talked to my son about that. But I could tell that just even looking at those medals brought back a lot of emotions and feelings about what it was like actually being there.
I can't imagine.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there were race riots.
Yeah. Yeah.
At different
Absolutely. He would tell me stories about, even in the mess hall or the kitchen where there would be physical, literal fights, Black soldiers against whites. Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah, that would break out. Or, Black vets knew not to go out by themselves because they would come back bruised or beaten or, rush to the hospital. Like, these things actually happen. I had a cousin that told me about how there were actual KKK groups that were amongst different, ranks and different branches of the military.
And I guess we shouldn't be surprised, but it's so frustrating to hear. Like, when
I was surprised, and I heard it all, seen a lot,
Right.
But even I was surprised to hear that, because you don't think of that level of segregation when it comes to something like the military, right? But then when I think about work that I've done in my practice with law enforcement, it's definitely there, right? So I'm thinking, why would I not? Or, why would I be surprised?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's where I was thinking too. I was like, well, we know historically, and people have said that law enforcement and the KKK, there was so much overlap.
Yeah.
Recruitment, even on purpose.
Yeah.
So why would we expect that the military would be devoid of
Absolutely.
it?
Even in the fire department, that's another one that comes up.
Yeah.
Because a lot of time vets will come out and they will go right into helping professions, law enforcement, firefighting, EMS. And it's like, we deal with the same thing on the fire department that we dealt with in the military.
And I think it's important to pause and just name, because some people are like, "Oh, you're bashing the military. You said this is to honor veterans." No, I actually think it's really important that we are honoring all veterans.
Absolutely.
By complicating the story of the idealized, romanticized service to your country, as it's so idyllic. Well, it's also complicated.
It's very complicated.
And so in some ways, to not talk about the experiences that have been shaped by race and class.
Absolutely.
When we talk about the draft and where people get placed and status and hierarchy, that actually robs them of being able to fully express what their experience was.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like they have to just shut that away.
Right. Right.
They don't get to name it.
They don't get to come out and have the same type of stories
Yeah.
that their comrades may have. And so you're right. I definitely don't want to be in a position of looking like we're bashing anything, because I honor and respect all of our veterans. I mean, it's certainly something that I didn't sign up for, so I have nothing but the utmost respect. But in giving a voice to those who had a very different experience, I think is also important.
I think it's essential.
Yeah,
it
is.
really is.
To tell the full story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just thinking about more broadly the intersection of being a veteran and mental health challenges.
Absolutely. Right. So you say that I'm going to go off and do this job because I can do it. I can shoulder this burden. And so to come back and not be the same, then there's this battle between, okay, I'm not sleeping, I'm not eating, I keep waking up at a certain time. I want to isolate myself. I can't go in a restaurant with my family and just enjoy the moment. I'm looking at the entrance, the exit, my back is to the wall, but I don't want to tell anybody because then I'll seem weak or I'll seem like I couldn't handle it, And so there's this ultra stigma for them of reaching help, because it's like, to get help is some admission of not being who you said you were when you signed up. And that is like the catch-22 of it.
Right. Well, that is another example of when we don't tell the full story, right?
Exactly.
So if we only tell the story of being brave and fighting and, and we don't say, and I was also scared.
Exactly.
And I also had to get support when I came home because of what I did. Then you leave people unable to share what they're experiencing.
Absolutely.
Which means they don't get help.
We don't hear a lot about that readjustment period, because it is not easy.
I can't imagine.
You go from a structured, regimented life, and then you're back home, and it's like, now what? I just wear regular clothes, and where do I work? They have the exact same pressures of, now I have to find a job. I have this family, I have to find income. And it's like, there isn't this fairy tale ending all the time. And so, we definitely have a large, population of homeless vets that live this reality of, I went in, I had an income, I knew what to do, I followed orders. Then I came back home, and now what?
Yeah.
What do I do?
And it's interesting to me, or maddening, frustrating, that we, especially when you talk about those who are unhoused, like there's such a judgment, kind of like a moral failing, like like you're not able to cut it. But there's such a high correlation between veteran status and being homeless that like I'm like, do we see this contradiction? That it's but then it also fits, because I'm going to say this, I don't think we are growing in our understanding of what it means to be a veteran and the mental health impacts.
Yeah.
Because not even 100 years ago, we didn't know what PTSD was.
Exactly.
We called it shell shock syndrome. People were shot for having it, right? So if we're honest, we are pretty judgmental of people for not being able to manage.
Yeah.
Being in the military. And so it frustrates me that we don't see the contradiction and that we have not done better by them.
Yeah, I think we definitely, even as a helping profession, have a long way to go.
Yeah.
But I think because of things like this, having the conversation, we make it that much more, put it much more on the lens of awareness. And so there's room for us to grow. And we're trying. We definitely have a long way to go, but yeah, I mean, it just doesn't really get the attention that it deserves. Or I think because Hollywood played such a large role in romanticizing, being in the military or being a soldier, and then you come back home to your family and life is good, that it leaves out a huge part of the real story. When you come back, you've been trained to be vigilant of where you are, your surroundings. So when you come back, does that just shut off? No, it doesn't. And there is no school you go to deprogram yourself. You're home and you're just supposed to adjust. It's one of the most difficult things that I hear a lot is that adjustment back, to being a civilian.
So what can we do as civilians? In your opinion, you've heard so many stories from veterans. what can we do? What do we need to know to support folks in their adjustment?
I think that, if you know a veteran, love a veteran, right? You make it okay to say, hey, do you need any support? How can I help you? Also being aware of the things that you see. Just even in our interaction with veterans, I've learned personally, like with my family, never to walk behind them, never to put my hand on their shoulder from behind. I make noise when I enter the room, not to say that something's wrong with them, but just to be respectful of the fact that I know you may still be in a difficult space and I want to respect that, So being patient, having access to information, if you were to just even Google, how can veterans get help or how can I help a homeless veteran? There's dozens of websites that'll pop up. And so just sharing that kind of information and normalizing it, and wanting to hear the stories about their time in, also being open to hearing, what were the difficult times? Do you want to share that? And how can I support you?
Right. And it makes me think about how with any mental health challenge, some people will default to, oh, you should be thankful that, oh, you should be so grateful that you're home, right? They try to make people
Right.
feel better by saying that. And I'm thinking in the context of veteran status, like that would be really minimizing, I would imagine.
Not only that, but a lot of veterans have survivor's guilt and they have this
Mm.
remorse like, you're right, I shouldn't be here. My best friend, he was there. He had this incident with the IUD and he didn't come back. It would have been better if I had because he paid the ultimate price and I didn't. So sometimes there's guilt that comes with that. So it is very minimizing, but also we have to realize, we don't know what they're thinking and what they're processing. So sometimes just asking versus assuming,
Yeah.
is also a good start.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that through your work with the Association of Black Psychologists,
Mhm.
that there's going to be an intentional focus on
Yes.
veterans and mental health. Can you talk more about that?
Yes. So we have several people within the Association of Black Psychologists that are veterans, some that are still active duty. And so we also recognize that we should also be doing our part in recognizing in uplifting our veterans and our active duty military servicemen and women. And so there's been talks about, even in the Journal of Black Psychology, having a focus on veterans and active duty servicemen and women. And so that's a big focus for us. And so we've been talking about it at the last convention. And so I'm very excited that we're, giving more attention to that amazing group of individuals.
Yeah. Yeah. And even thinking about intersectionality there, what are some of the challenges that come for women in the military and
my
maybe even
goodness.
women of color, right? Do you have anything to share there?
Absolutely. Because not only do you have the burden of not being home, being away, and having to trust a group of strangers, but then with women, sexual assault is rampant in the military. I mean, 1 in 4, 1 in 3 women will have been sexually harassed or sexually violated. So that's the additional lens. And then also being given occupations below what you test for or not given rank because you're Black and a female. That population, has definitely should be a spotlight in honoring their heroism because the stories that I've heard from them it's unbelievable. I have colleagues that are in ABSI that are female and have served in the things that they've gone through. You wouldn't imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh. So is there a place for women and women of color to have these conversations or even veterans of color? Like where are these conversations happening?
I
Or is it
know.
only when they work themselves up to go seek therapy or is the military, do you know of any efforts?
I don't know of anything as far as those that are active duty. I know that when you're out, that there are different places that people can go to, like the vet center. There's vet centers in every state that, is not associated with a hospital that people can go to get support and talk about trauma and things like that. And those often have different divisions and sectors for women and then for women of color. But the women that I know that have served, it's just been them gathering amongst themselves to say, hey, I share your experience with you. Let's talk about that. Or sometimes they don't talk about it. Just knowing that, like, I know what you went through, it's like a silent sisterhood or a bond.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh. I can't imagine.
Yeah.
And that's part of why I don't ever question, giving appreciation and thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I've even raised my son that whenever we see someone, whether if they're wearing a hat that identifies their status or if they're in fatigues, he always says, thank you for your service. And sometimes, and I've heard from others that, it's a negative reminder, but usually people who identify themselves as military servicemen or women are okay with hearing that. So I tell them, by all means, you say that because you have no idea the sacrifice that individual gave.
Right.
Yeah.
No, you really don't.
Yeah.
I do think it's important to thank people for their service.
Absolutely.
And I also clearly, because we're doing this episode, think it's really important to highlight the nuances and the complexity of service when you're a member
Absolutely.
of a marginalized group. And
Yeah.
so I'm just naming that I know that sometimes people feel like to question or to critique is to be anti-American.
Right.
And I think
Yeah.
about Crossroads anti-racism training talks, one of the trainers talks a lot about being a critical lover, right? That if you're a critic and an institution can do no right, people stop listening. If you're a lover and an institution can do no wrong, people are just like, yeah. They just, no matter what they do, they're a lover.
Right.
But
right.
you want critical lovers, people who love you enough to critique you so you can do better.
Absolutely.
And so that's my thought and opinion. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
It's very touchy, right? Because when you have individuals who have made an ultimate sacrifice, depending on where that individual is, they can hear critique as you're right because I experienced that while I was in, or they can hear it as you're dumping on everything that I've stood for.
Right. Like, how dare you?
Exactly. So it's touchy. Now, I will say that within the Association of Black Psychologists, we do certain groundwork training, emotional emancipation circles. And so we've even ran this training with groups that have had veterans within it. And so for them, when people critique patriotism or taking a knee during the Star Spangled Banner, to hear the responses, it kind of varies. For them, it's, I can understand it. I'm not saying that I don't like this country. Of course I do, because I stood up for this country. But I do want to bring awareness that we have some issues that need to be brought to light. And so you get to hear those very complicated conversations. So
yeah, no, it's complicated because on the one hand, we know that Kaepernick was told to take a knee. A veteran told him that would be a respectful way to protest, right?
Absolutely.
And then we also don't want to allow one person to be a spokesperson for all veterans.
Absolutely. So even on, I followed that through Facebook. You had some veterans that were saying, I agree. What is going on in our society tonight is not what I went and fought for. They are not demonstrating the American values that I put my life on the line for. So I stand with him. Then you had others that say, well, how dare you? I lost friends, I lost loved ones, and here you are spitting in the face of everything they did. So it becomes a very touchy situation. And when I'm working with veterans in private practice, I kind of follow their lead on that subject if it gets to that topic.
Well, I can't imagine how it couldn't.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's just, it's so intertwined.
It is because I'm one of those people who my default is always utmost honor and respect. Thank you very much. Thank you for your service. Patriotic. I teach my son the same. And then there's some that say, but why? They did this to me. They did that to me. I've been denied this. I don't respect it. So then I'm like, okay, well, let me give you this space to tell your story.
Right.
And then I hear the stories about being denied benefits or not being believed, or, I went there with these individuals and they received these benefits and I don't. And, so those are still stories that happen.
Really?
So it does become very complicated to say the least.
Oh gosh, I
Yeah.
didn't even think about how benefits would play into it.
Oh my gosh. I have family members now that are in this process of saying, I went, I served, I sustained this injury. I'm no longer able to work. I'm applying for this benefit and being told no, or they're not believed, or they're being questioned. Because whoever interviews you or examines you, it ends up being their opinion, right? And so we know as psychologists,
Ooh-wee.
especially if you do forensic work, your ability to identify with the person you're working with shows in your ability to advocate or not for them, right? Your ability to believe and trust that they're a reliable informant. And so when you have no connection with the person you're interviewing and you give your opinion and you're a person of color sitting across from someone who doesn't look like you, that's a whole nother subject.
Well, especially if that person doesn't see your full humanity.
Absolutely.
And believes the lies.
Absolutely.
The lies that have been told about you and your people group.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so there's research studies out about that, because in the military, they're able to apply for things like a service connection benefit, which means they sustained an injury while they were in. And so because of that injury, now that they're out, they aren't able to earn their full potential. So they can apply for a monthly stipend to help compensate for treatment and care and things like that. And so there's research studies that have been published that show that overwhelming majority of African-American vets are often denied when they apply for benefits for post-traumatic stress disorder compared to vets who are white. And so, there's another undercurrent of looking at how that plays out. So
yes,
complication is a very light way to put it.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. I mean, that just speaks to a lot of the research, even outside of the military, around narratives, assumptions, who's believed, who's not,
disability in general.
Yes, who's seen as malingering, who's seen as
absolutely
wanting a handout, and
exactly.
how that gets framed around race and class often.
Absolutely.
But race, absolutely, it's a racialized conversation.
Yeah. And I know that this particular episode is on veterans, but even in my private practice doing disability evaluations, you come across the same thing.
Really?
Because we would have veterans that would come in and apply because they weren't able to get certain things when they applied to the military. So they would try like SSI. And you're looking at these records and you see the history and you're like, who would not believe that you have PTSD? But it's a struggle that they've gone through. And then you read the exams from your colleagues and it's like malingering, or respondent says this, but it may be due to drugs and alcohol, without a thought that,
oh my,
having unhealthy coping skills to cope with flashbacks and nightmares is what any human person would do. You do the best you can with the skills that you have. And so why would we not think that consuming alcohol or smoking cigarettes is a way of trying to self-medicate versus the reason why they are where they are? And so I see it all the time. Definitely.
So then no wonder there would be this feeling of, I shouldn't seek help. I should be able to get myself together. There's a stigma.
Absolutely.
And you're judged.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Because when you are seeing someone and you're giving your full honest truth about what you've gone through, and you do mention a stint of binge drinking or cannabis use or whatever have you, that becomes the main focus of your assessment, and especially for veterans. I've spoken to, my uncle would tell me never had a cigarette, never drank alcohol, but you go into the military and you're in combat zones, especially when they were in Vietnam, there were ration cigarettes. Everybody had flasks, right? So then you come back and now you smoke cigarette and you're told, cut out tobacco. It's like, well, you
literally gave this to me. Oh my goodness. I had no idea.
Everyone had smoke breaks. So if you weren't a smoker, then you just didn't get a break. That's what he told me, yeah. And so it was more to your advantage to be a smoker than to not. So then you start smoking as a way to cope and to deal with the nerves. And then you come back and you're just supposed to stop? Exactly. So, that's just one of the, many examples and stories that I've heard from him and, from others that, we just set up this, I don't know, almost like stacking the deck almost against you. Yeah.
And we have so much research in like the addictions literature to know that, for example, the smoking and the drinking, right? Like you mentioned, it's to cope with the stress of the environment.
Absolutely.
Right. Like, so people don't just want to be addicted.
Exactly.
And so then it's like we go back to this, it's a moral failing on your part when we know that's not the case. Why are we stuck in old frames?
Absolutely.
Well,
yeah. We've got to do better.
We have to do better. Yeah. And our veterans deserve better.
They absolutely do. They absolutely do.
Well, I mean, I thank you for sitting down and talking with us.
Absolutely.
Because this is, I mean, I've learned a lot, and it's just made me think about the different tensions and dynamics that come into play for veterans. If you were to suggest to people a place to donate or a website to visit to learn more about these dynamics, where would you encourage them to go or give?
Well, I'm a member of the Association of Black Psychologists, so we usually have research and things up on the website that people can go to. I would always say go to any local veteran-related organization. You have things like Disabled American Veterans, the DAV. You have vet centers. But, just getting people to just Google, local vet service or local vet shelter and seeing what's in your area, because sometimes we aren't aware of where we can recommend people to go.
Yeah. And I thank you for doing this
absolutely
area of clinical work.
Oh, thank you.
Because it's important, right? And it's important that we as clinicians talk to each other because, I have people come through. I don't necessarily have a big private practice, but, for me to be aware of that aspect of their identity. And like I said, in my own consulting work, when I'm working with people in corporations and spaces, people carry that with them. That's a part of who they are.
It's a huge part. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have so much respect for veterans. And so I hope that in our conversation, talking about the dynamics of the military as an organization, in no way, makes any veteran feel slighted. And so because I have the utmost respect, and when I see them, I do thank them for their service. I do want us to all be better in recognizing that mental health is definitely a major and huge factor that should be considered when we are talking about those who have served this country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining me on this special edition of Raising Equity in honor of Veterans Day, in honor of all the veterans who have served and who have given the ultimate sacrifice. I'll see you next time on Raising Equity.